Hi, Round Coffee here. Today I'm going to explain the sci-fi thriller Spiderhead. Lock in and subtitles on. Enjoy. Take a journey to the technologically advanced prison of Spiderhead, located on a stunning tropical island. A chosen group of prisoners have been selected for a one-of-a-kind chance to enjoy a luxurious life, with private living spaces, designated responsibilities, and multiple recreational activities. In exchange, they have agreed to participate in experiments that examine the impact of chemicals that can alter emotions. The inmates carry a small MobiPack device filled with these potent substances and must give their consent with a simple "acknowledge" before receiving a new dose. The experiments are led by the talented Steve Abnesti and his assistant Mark. During a recent session, Steve administered a dose of the potent chemical G46 to Ray, causing him to burst into uncontrollable laughter as Steve told a series of silly jokes. Despite Mark's efforts to bring the mood down with depressing historical facts, Ray remained in a state of hysteria due to the effects of the G46. Steve noted the results and added a golden star to his notebook with a nod of approval. The following day, Jeff was taken aback when he was escorted out of the facility while blindfolded for a special trial. After receiving a dose of N40 and having his blindfold removed, Jeff was presented with a breathtaking and awe-inspiring scene. Despite struggling to put his amazement into words, Jeff was then given a dose of B15, leading to a fluent expression of his thoughts. Infused with the power of B15, Jeff eloquently described the stunning surroundings. However, the reality was far from his poetic portrayal. In truth, Jeff had been observing a heavily polluted wasteland. Upon returning to the prison, Jeff formed a partnership with Lizzie, a fellow inmate and his romantic interest, as they fulfilled their snack-making responsibilities. This interaction allowed them to build a connection, bond, and share stories about their experiences with the experiments. As the day comes to a close, Jeff retires to his room where he indulges in his passion for drawing intricate works of art on his Etch-a-Sketch. Though it brings him solace, it also invites reminders of the tragedy that landed him in prison. One fateful night, at a party with close friends Adam and Emma, Jeff succumbs to overindulgence and, in a drunken state, gets behind the wheel of a car alongside Adam. Tragically, his impaired driving results in a crash that takes Adam's life. For the next experiment, Jeff is paired with the lovely Heather, a fellow inmate. To ensure that their previous interactions were limited, Steve double-checks before inquiring about their mutual attraction. To his surprise, their interest in each other was only moderate. However, after receiving a dose of the potent N40, Jeff and Heather are struck by an intense, irresistible physical attraction to each other. In a moment of passion, they surrender to their feelings right in front of the cameras and researchers. As they bask in the afterglow, the couple cuddles and even professes their love for each other. Steve and Mark were overjoyed with the successful outcome of the N40 experiment and celebrated their accomplishment. However, Steve exercised caution in his celebration and held off on awarding his signature gold star until he could evaluate any subsequent effects. Later, when Jeff was serving food, he encountered Heather, leading to an uncomfortable interaction between the two. Despite a lack of residual romantic attraction, Steve repeated the N40 experiment, pairing Jeff with Sarah, a mature prisoner who held no attraction for Jeff. Nevertheless, after receiving a double dose of N40, Jeff found himself unable to control his impulses. While refilling Jeff's MobiPack, Mark advised him to be cautious during his intimate experiences, as the device was prone to damage with even a minor impact, potentially leading to a loss of control. Taking advantage of the opportunity, Jeff requested a change of duties, citing a desire for variation, but with an ulterior motive. The subsequent day, Jeff was surprised when he found himself at the scientist's desk with Steve and Mark for their latest experiment. There were 2 rooms in use, with Dave in one, consuming large quantities of food with only brief intervals for vomiting. Meanwhile, Jeff encountered Heather and Sarah in the other room. Steve proposes a straightforward challenge for Jeff. He must pick one of the two and administer Darkenflox, a substance Steve describes as a harmless agitator. Jeff is uneasy with the task and declines to choose, explaining that if he had to, It would be purely by chance, as he has no particular fondness for either of them. He refuses simply because he had been subjected to the chemical before and vividly recalls how unpleasant the experience was. Steve finds Jeff's reactions intriguing, as he has undergone varying doses, yet the outcome remains unchanged. Later on, Lizzie tries to approach Jeff to inquire about his change in chores. However, their conversation is abruptly cut short by the guards who remind Jeff that today is his designated day off. He is permitted to leave the facility for a walk and to call Emma, but as usual he is sent straight to her voicemail. Jeff leaves a message apologizing and expressing how much he misses her, like he always does, but this time he also mentions Lizzie. For their next experiment, Jeff is paired up with Rogan, a formidable and aggressive man. Jeff, who has no attraction to men, is worried that he may be forced to engage with Rogan and therefore refuses to accept any dose. To his relief, nothing occurs, and they are allowed to leave after a brief wait. Upon deducing the situation, Jeff hastened to the scientist's room to verify his suspicions. Heather had been assigned to administer Darkenflox to either Jeff or Rogan, but had chosen not to do so. This indicated that Heather had engaged in a session with Rogan during one of the experiments. Infuriated, Jeff asked if everyone was involved with one another, and Steve presented him with a chart that illustrated the relationships among the prisoners. Steve explained that it was part of the experimental design established by the Protocol Committee, a design that he personally opposed. When Jeff expressed his dissatisfaction with the unethical aspects of the experiments, Steve reminded him that he had voluntarily participated, with the alternative being a harsh state jail surrounded by corrupt law enforcement. Fearing the loss of his benefits, Jeff apologized and returned for another session with Rogan. Thankfully, Sarah also chooses not to administer Darkenflox to either of them. After the experiment, Steve thinks they're close to giving it a glowing recommendation, but Mark is beginning to feel uneasy as well. Steve reassures him that this is important work to make the world a better place, and Mark leaves for the weekend in a more positive state of mind. Later, Steve decides to treat himself to a dose of N40, something the prisoners are unaware of, as he also carries a Moby pack. As Jeff and Lizzie share dinner, Jeff describes the horrible effects of Darkenflox. Lizzie holds his hand and inquires why he changed chores. Jeff tells her that this place messes with his mind and he often forgets who he was before arriving, but when he's with her, he feels truly like himself. On Monday, Steve considered taking a chance and requested Mark to administer a triple dose of the chemicals on himself. Jeff arrived for the day's experiment and noticed them, but the scientists swiftly concealed everything, so Jeff decided to remain silent. For the next experiment, Steve informed Jeff that they needed to continue with the Darkenflox testing as mandated by the committee. Jeff was uncertain about administering the dose to Heather, but Steve encouraged him to proceed, reminding Jeff of Heather's past misconduct and the fact that he was selected for this task instead of Rogan. Jeff pleaded with Steve to request the committee to change their decision, but Steve left the room, claiming to make the call but actually getting coffee and talking with Lizzie. When Steve returned, he falsely informed Jeff that the committee wouldn't change their stance and that Jeff must complete the experiment or face expulsion. Reluctantly, Jeff administered Darkenflox to Heather, causing her severe pain. Later, Mark also gave Jeff B15 to enhance Jeff's capability to describe Heather's distress, remorse, and lack of attraction. In the heat of the moment, Heather's wild thrashing causes her to hit the wall and break her Moby pack, causing a flood of Darkenflox to pour into her. Her reaction becomes incredibly violent, leading her to shatter a vase and use the fragments to take her own life before Mark can intervene. Both Steve and Mark race to her side, with Steve dropping his keys in the commotion. While they argue, Jeff sees an opportunity to investigate, snagging Steve's keys and using them to gain access to his notebook. He finds several intriguing discoveries. To Jeff's surprise, he finds a formula for OBDX with the Abnesti Pharmaceuticals logo at the top. This revelation means that there is no committee and Steve is in charge of a private operation. Additionally, Jeff uncovers a bingo card filled with gold stars, except for two numbers, 6 and 40. By lifting the stars, Jeff realizes the numbers correspond to the chemicals they have been testing. N40 is the only one without a star, as it hasn't achieved the goal of true love yet. Meanwhile, B6 is what Mark replenishes in the Moby packs of all participants. As Jeff delves deeper, he catches sight of Steve's return and swiftly conceals the evidence, tossing the keys back to the floor. Later, Mark presses Steve to report the incident, but Steve declines. He knows reporting it would lead to their downfall, and they've already strayed too far to turn back now. Steve attempts to console Jeff with a carefully crafted speech, but it falls short of the desired effect. Instead, Steve shares the results of the chemical test on Ray, which leads to a bout of uncontrolled laughter, even as he reveals a personal story about his father abandoning him in childhood. Jeff wonders why Steve never leaves the facility like Mark, to which Steve simply replies that the project is his true love. Lizzie, the next participant in the experiment, is given a chemical that causes intense phobia and is paralyzed with fear upon encountering ordinary objects like a stapler. After the experiment, she confides in Jeff about her trauma and shame. Jeff empathizes with her and reveals that his own request for a change in duties was driven by shame. Lizzie is puzzled by their compliance for petty luxuries, and Jeff shares his story of a fateful night when his drunk driving resulted in the deaths of Adam and Emma, leaving him consumed by guilt ever since. Jeff and Lizzie share a comforting embrace and finally kiss, before Jeff begins to formulate a plan after observing them eating in the kitchen. Upon reviewing the security footage and discovering Jeff has been sketching Lizzie, Steve confirms his suspicion and retires for the night after taking another dose of N40. The following day, Steve invites Jeff for another experiment, to administer Darkenflox to Lizzie. Jeff declines and Steve allows him to leave unscathed. As soon as Jeff exits, Steve instructs Mark to double his dose of B6. Upon Mark's arrival, Jeff challenges him with the truth that he knows there's no committee, and B6 isn't a harmless placebo, but rather the sole chemical Steve is invested in. Mark reveals that he once wanted to work with a brilliant mind and bring about change to the world, but now he has second thoughts. Jeff spots this, and together they hatch a plan before Mark departs for the weekend. The following Monday, Jeff is given the responsibility to administer Darkenflox to Lizzie, but he refuses to do so, much to Steve's anger. Steve, unable to comprehend the bond between Jeff and Lizzie, attempts to convince Jeff to administer the dose by getting Lizzie to reveal her past mistake. She left her daughter in a car, leading to the baby's death. Lizzie cries and pleads for the chemicals, but Jeff presses the control screen. However, Jeff was actually dosed with Darkenflox by Mark, who altered the programming and added extra doses of B6 to Steve's Moby pack. Jeff first exposes Steve to the fear chemical and then gives him Darkenflox. While Steve suffers, Jeff informs him that Mark is coming with the police and reveals the true purpose of the experiment. B6 is a mind control substance designed to make people comply with orders. The product name Obidiex is a play on the word obedience. Despite his pain, Steve thinks the chemical has potential for positive purposes, but full obedience hasn't been achieved yet, as the subject's strong emotions can still resist. Steve also confesses that Jeff and Lizzie had completed their sentences days earlier and never informed them. Infuriated, Jeff pushes Steve's head onto the table and forces him to use his fingerprint on the control panel to unlock the front door, so Jeff can escape and tell the world about Heather's death. On his way out, Jeff notices Steve reaching for a knife and demands that he hand it over. However, Steve is able to ignore that direct order, even while on the effects of the extra B6 dose. The chemical isn't strong enough to overpower real feelings, and like Steve told Jeff the other day, this project is his one true love, so he'll defend it with his life. Steve hits Jeff and steals the control to give Lizzie 4 doses of Darkenflox, which immediately makes her go crazy. Jeff attacks Steve, making him drop and break the control in the ensuing fight, but by pushing him against the wall he also breaks Steve's Moby pack. The sudden rush of chemicals weakens Steve, giving Jeff the chance to push him away, steal the keys and run to check on Lizzie. Jeff jumps into action and revives Lizzie's breathing. He then opens her Moby pack and empties out all the chemical bottles. Lizzie feels guilty for not admitting her wrongdoings earlier, but Jeff comforts her and reminds her of his unwavering love. The two of them gear up for their escape plan. Steve sounds the alarm. He warns the other inmates that if they don't put a stop to Jeff and Lizzie's plan, they'll lose all their perks. Just then, Steve spots the police closing in on the facility through the security cameras. He quickly snatches as many chemical vials as he can carry and makes a run for it. As Jeff and Lizzie prepare to leave the facility, they work together to overcome challenges posed by Sarah and Ray. Dave tries to intervene, but Lizzie skillfully avoids any confrontations by handing him the keys to the pantry. The pair successfully eludes their pursuers and secure the door to the final hallway. Upon exiting, they notice that Steve has already taken off on his personal aircraft, so they hastily board a motorboat and embark on their journey. Mark, along with the police officers in their boats, witnesses Steve's flight. However, he has nothing to fear as the N-40 has taken control of Steve's mind. Instead of seeing the mountain in front of him, Steve only sees a stunning view leading to his inevitable crash into it. Jeff and Lizzie observe the detonation and perceive it as ironically humorous. Jeff concludes that self-forgiveness does not have a simple solution and is instead a personal journey that each individual must embark on.